Now, it should go without saying that there has been virtually no oversight or serious monitoring of where these weapon systems are going or where this money is going. Ukraine, of course, has long been described as the most corrupt country in Europe, so you can only imagine in the middle of a war with billions of dollars flying around, how little tracing there is or monitoring is of where that money is actually going. There was a inspector general finally appointed for the war in Afghanistan who discovered billions and billions of dollars in unaccounted for money and was scathing in his reports about the need for greater safeguards, which ultimately were finally applied because Congress realized how much of this money was disappearing in unaccounted for ways. And of course, the same thing is happening in Ukraine because there has been no oversight and no safeguards from the beginning. So here is an article from CNN in April of last year, the title of which is "What Happens to Weapons Sent to Ukraine?" The U.S. doesn't really know. And the first paragraph reads, quote, "The U.S. has few ways to track the substantial supply of anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and other weaponry that is sent across the border into Ukraine," sources tell CNN, "a blind spot that's due in large part to the lack of U.S. boots on the ground in the country and the easy portability of many of the smaller systems now pouring across the border. It's a conscious risk the Biden administration is willing to take. In the short term, the U.S. sees the transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment to be vital to the Ukrainians' ability to hold off Moscow's invasion. A senior defense official said Tuesday that it is, quote, certainly the largest recent supply to a partner country in a conflict. But the risk, both current U.S. officials say and defense analysts say, is that in the long term, some of these weapons may wind up in the hands of other militaries and militias that the U.S. did not intend to arm. Oh, you don't say. That's what happens in every war. And I'm sure it is only a matter of time before we hear that we have to go to some new war in some new place because the weapons we poured into the Ukrainian battlefield ended up in the hands of neo-Nazi militias like the Azov Battalion, who sold it to black markets all over Europe and elsewhere in the Middle East. And so there's no safeguards, there's no provisions on the flow of this money. Even if you're somebody who supports the ongoing expenditure of hundreds of billions of dollars for a war that the Biden administration itself says has brought us closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any point in 1962, if you're one of the people who believes that's worth it over who rules Eastern Ukraine, at least you should want, in fact, if you're somebody who wants that money going for that, you should, of all people, should want safeguards and monitoring and oversight on where this money is going. And yet the people in Washington who, at least until this week, who have been the most vocal about sending this money over to Kiev have continuously blocked attempts at oversight. So last year, as you might recall, Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, the Republican senator from Kentucky, introduced a bill, an amendment that he tried to latch on to the expenditure of $40 billion that was to go to Ukraine. You might remember that the Biden administration requested $33 billion be expended by the Congress, authorized by the Congress, and they arbitrarily raised it by $7 billion to $40 billion. Every single Democratic member of Congress in both the Senate and the House voted yes to send $40 billion to Ukraine. And most of the Republican caucus did as well. There were 6 or so House Republicans who voted no, and 11 Republican senators who voted no. But the bulk of the Republican Party joined with the unanimous Democratic Party and Bernie Sanders to vote yes. And the Senate was so desperate to get this money approved that they tried to fast track it, which required unanimous consent, and Rand Paul refused to give it because he wanted to impose the condition that there be a new inspector general office, or rather to require the existing inspector general, the one that did such a good job in the war in Afghanistan, to now start monitoring, like they did for the war in Afghanistan, where this money is going in Ukraine. And he was laughed out of the Senate by virtually every member of both parties. Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell both implied that he was doing Putin's bidding. And so now he's back, Rand Paul is, a year later, many billions of dollars more, to try once again to introduce a bill that would provide for the same exact oversight. So here you see the press release from Rand Paul's office this week, the headline of which is Dr. Paul introduces bill to provide much needed oversight for Ukraine spending. And it reads, quote, today, U.S. Senator Rand Paul, ranking member of the Senate Homeland Security Committee and Governmental Affairs Committee, introduced the Ukraine Aid Oversight Act, which would expand or extend the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, oversight authority to supervise American spending to Ukraine in order to detect and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. Quote, a little over a year ago, I proposed an amendment to the massive $40 billion Ukraine spending package that would have entrusted a proven and effective inspector general to oversee and track how funds are spent in Ukraine. My amendment was rejected, and today over $113 billion in taxpayer dollars have been sent to Ukraine without proper oversight, said Dr. Paul. My Ukraine Aid Oversight Act would extend SIGAR's oversight authority to include aid to Ukraine and provide taxpayers with an accurate accounting of how their money is spent, as well as to detect and prevent waste and fraud. Last year, Dr. Paul offered a similar proposal as an amendment to the first Ukraine spending package. Since then, the U.S. has spent over $113 billion to Ukraine. Given the fast-evolving situation on the ground in Ukraine and the significant sums already committed, the American taxpayers deserve the oversight experience of tried-and-true investigatory personnel to detect and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, that to me seems just intuitively reasonable, the idea that if we're going to send over $100 billion and counting to a war zone to the most corrupt country in Europe, we should at least have robust oversight provisions to ensure that the money is going for the intended purpose. And yet, amazingly, there was contempt heaped on Senator Paul for trying to do that, and he was cast as a Russian propagandist. Here is a video from a report on what happened back in May of last year with regard to this oversight.
To the U.S. Constitution, not to any foreign nation, and no matter how sympathetic the cause, my oath of office is to the national security of the United States of America. We cannot save Ukraine by dooming the U.S. economy. This bill under consideration would spend $40 billion. This is the second spending bill for Ukraine in 2 months, and this bill is 3 times larger than the first. Our military aid to Ukraine is nothing new, though. Since 2014, the United States has provided more than $6 billion in security assistance to Ukraine, in addition to the $14 billion Congress authorized just a month ago. If this bill passes, the U.S. will have authorized roughly $60 billion in total spending for Ukraine. For those who say this is not...
So that bill did pass, as I said, with unanimous Democratic support and overwhelming Republican majority support. But Rand Paul's amendment to provide oversight did not succeed. As a result, a month or so later, the Ukrainian government issued a blacklist of American citizens that it claims were Russian propagandists. And on that list appeared Congressman Paul, or Senator Paul, as well as former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, along with myself and Professor Mearsheimer. So this is the effort to suggest that any Americans who exercise our constitutional right to oppose the U.S. government's role in Ukraine, or even to question where this money is going, are to be deemed Russian propagandists on an official blacklist issued by the Ukrainian government that on the one hand demands that U.S. citizens give our taxpayer money, our hard-earned money, to their government, and on the other issues these blacklists about our journalists and our politicians who question the U.S. government's role in Ukraine. That's what the Ukrainian government is. That's what this whole dynamic has become. Now, in addition to Senator Paul's bill that he's renewing this year, there is a separate amendment that a Republican congressman who is a vigorous supporter of President Biden's proxy war spending in Ukraine, which is Roger Wicker of Mississippi. And he introduced an amendment which had the co-sponsorship of 3 Republican senators, including Senator Kennedy of Louisiana, who is also a stalwart supporter of the war in Ukraine. So these are not people trying to impede the war in Ukraine. It was also supported by Utah's Mike Lee and Kyrsten Sinema. And the idea, as you can see on the screen, was to create a separate inspector general modeled after the one that was used for the war in Afghanistan so successfully, to require them to engage in oversight about where this money is going. Here you see Senator Wicker introducing his amendment. It was a very narrow amendment that would do nothing other than attach to the military spending bill an amendment that would simply create an office of an inspector general to trace where this money in Ukraine is going, because nobody knows where it is. Here you see the key provision of the bill. It says there is established the office of the lead inspector general for Ukraine assistance to provide for the oversight of independent and objective conduct and supervision of audits and investigations relating to the programs and operations funded with amounts appropriated for the United States by the United States for Ukraine, appointment of lead inspector general, and it provides for how they're to be appointed. And then it goes on to say that the key roles, the duties of this inspector general are as follows. 1, to appoint from among the offices of the inspector general an assistant inspector general for Ukraine assistance who shall supervise auditing and investigative activities and assist the lead inspector general in the discharge of responsibilities under this subsection. To develop and carry out in coordination with the offices of the inspector general a joint strategic plan to conduct comprehensive oversight of all amounts appropriated by the United States for Ukraine, to apply key lessons from prior oversight work in coordination with the offices of the Inspector General to Ukraine response programs and operations to minimize waste, fraud, and abuse. So it is exactly what it sounds like, a very narrow amendment that would do nothing other than create an Inspector General modeled after the one that saved so much money and detected so much fraud and corruption in the war in Afghanistan. It would genuinely seem impossible that anyone would oppose this. And yet, it failed. It did not get implemented. The Senate blocked its enactment. Here you see the roll call vote. There were 51 yes votes and 48 no votes. And because the Democrats invoked the Jim Crow racist filibuster, as they call it, 60 votes were needed for passage. They only got 51 votes, which is a majority of the senators, but that was 9 votes short needed for passage. So the Democrats not only voted no, but they invoked a filibuster to ensure there was no actual vote on this amendment. That's how badly they wanted to ensure that there was no oversight on the hundreds of billions of dollars they're going to end up spending in Ukraine. They've already spent $113 billion. So let's take a look at the vote, which I put here on the screen. It was essentially a party line vote with a couple of exceptions. So every Democratic senator voted no against this amendment to create an inspector general, with the exception of 2 Democratic senators who voted yes, one of whom was John Ossoff. Let me get a different pen, one you can actually see. There's John Ossoff, he voted yes. And the other Democratic senator who voted yes was John Tester of Montana. That's how the 51 majority vote total was received. Every Republican voted yes in favor of these oversight provisions, with one exception, and that was Senator Paul. He was the only Republican who voted no. Now, we reached out to his office to ask why he voted no, but I can almost guarantee what the reason is, knowing Senator Paul and his work and his vote history, which is that on principle, he opposes the creation of a new office, a new inspector general, when he believes the current one that is already in place, that was already spent and created, the one that worked on Afghanistan, can simply be transferred to this work in Ukraine. In fact, in his statement, he essentially says, my bill's better because it doesn't require the creation of a new agency. But on principle, Rand Paul wants the same amount of oversight as every other Senate Republican who voted yes. He just, on principle, didn't want to create a new agency. In addition to the no votes from every single Democratic senator, you also had the ostensible independents, including August King of Maine, who voted no, and Bernie Sanders, who voted no. There you see Sinema's vote. She voted yes as an independent. She was one of the co-sponsors of the bill. That means that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren both voted no. There you see Elizabeth Warren's vote on oversight for hundreds of billions of dollars sent to Ukraine. And what makes this so amazing is that Bernie Sanders was one of the leading advocates for exactly this kind of oversight when it came to the war in Afghanistan. And he praised on the work of the Inspector General in detecting huge amounts of corruption in the billions of dollars that went to Afghanistan. And Elizabeth Warren has been urging these kinds of audits and this kind of oversight for banking expenditures and all kinds of other expenditures because of how much corruption and fraud takes place when everybody gets to have a party with U.S. taxpayer-funded money when no one is watching as a watchdog. And yet, for some reason, and we also reached out to Senator Sanders' office to try and find out why he voted no, not just Senate Democrats who support the war, but also supposedly their left-wing senators who hate large amounts of waste in the military-industrial complex, like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, also don't want oversight or audits on this massive amounts of money being poured into Kiev. Just ask yourself, why would that be? We see the record of even CNN acknowledging that nobody has any idea where this money is going, where these weapon systems are ending up. Why would you possibly oppose oversight on where this money is going unless you don't want the public to know how it's actually being used? That's the only conceivable reason to vote no. Now, one of the arguments of the Defense Department is, oh, you don't have to worry. We audit our own money. We audit where this money is going. Just leave it to us. And I don't even think anyone would be willing to go on camera and say that with a straight face, given the fact that the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, has failed every audit to which it's been subjected ever since auditing requirements were put into place a decade ago. Here you see from The Hill in November of 2022, the headline, Defense Department fails another audit but makes progress. Quote, the Defense Department has failed its 5th ever audit, unable to account for more than half of its assets. But the effort is being viewed as a teachable moment, according to its chief financial officer. Yeah, they failed for the 5th time in a row, but we're learning now. After 1,600 auditors combed through DOD's $3.5 trillion in assets and $3.7 trillion in liabilities, officials found that the department couldn't account for about 61% of its assets, Pentagon Comptroller Mike McCord told reporters on Tuesday. Federal law since the early 1990s requires mandatory audits for all government agencies, and since fiscal year 2013, all but the DOD have been able to satisfy that requirement. The sheer size and scope of the department, which makes up for more than half of the U.S. discretionary spending and has assets that range from the personnel and supplies to bases and weapons, makes it difficult to audit. Obviously, there's no oversight from a department that can't even pass an audit for its basic budget. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.